This is Nick. Welcome to GeoX, Global Intelligence Node. Deep State has now acknowledged the Russian military's advances in Kostiantynivka. China has achieved something unprecedented by successfully landing a reusable rocket stage on a sea platform, breaking America's long-standing monopoly on controlled landings of reusable launch systems. Meanwhile, Turkey has refused to join the proposed defense bank, undermining one of the key pillars Europe hoped would strengthen its influence over Ankara. Let's begin with the situation on the Ukrainian front, where the fighting continues to intensify. I told you earlier that Ukraine's refusal to acknowledge the loss of Kostiantynivka was largely driven by the NATO summit. During such a summit, admitting setbacks on the battlefield simply wasn't politically acceptable. I also said that within a few weeks, Ukraine would eventually recognize Russian advances inside the city, and that only months later would it officially acknowledge losing it altogether. In fact, I expected that admission only after Russian forces reached Drushkivka. Instead, events have moved even faster than I anticipated. Deep State has already confirmed Russian gains inside Kostiantynivka. To be clear, Russian forces captured the city last week. But I also want to remind you that capturing a city and establishing complete control over it are two very different things. There is no such thing as absolute control on a modern battlefield. Today's combat zone often stretches nearly 25 miles deep, only when the front line has moved. Roughly that distance beyond Kostiantynivka will Russian military police be able to patrol the city freely and a stable occupation. Authority truly exists. Right now, the city remains an active combat zone under Russian control, not a fully secured rear area. At the same time, just as we've seen in Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad, and other locations, Ukrainian troops continue infiltrating territories already seized by Russian forces. They film videos, post them online, and claim they're operating freely inside Kostiantynivka. That's simply part of today's information war. Modern warfare doesn't create a continuous, uninterrupted line of control. There are no massive defensive belts extending deep behind advancing troops. The reason is straightforward. Decades ago, a single division could hold roughly 9 miles of front. Today, that same distance may be covered by only a battalion. As a result, only isolated strongpoints remain. Everything between them can often be crossed through concealed movement. That's the reality you should use when evaluating what's actually happening on the battlefield. I want to repeat something I've said many times before. Don't judge this war by old World War II standards, where headlines simply announce that one side has captured another city. Instead, watch how the front line actually moves. Watch who is advancing. Watch which strongpoints change hands. That's what really matters. By that measure, Russian forces clearly maintain the initiative, including in Kostiantynivka. Ukraine's situation is far less favorable than official statements would suggest. Of course, governments have to keep public morale alive. Otherwise, people begin asking uncomfortable questions. Many Ukrainians are already reluctant to fight. If the full reality of the battlefield became widely understood, that reluctance would only grow. Interesting information has also emerged from a Ukrainian serviceman assigned to a logistics unit. According to him, our ability to supply the front is heading toward complete collapse. Keep that in mind. Russian forces have dramatically increased their strikes against Ukraine's logistics network. If they continue hitting major logistics hubs and distribution centers, including facilities connected to large retail chains and delivery infrastructure, the military will face the greatest consequences. Ukraine's supply system is deeply integrated with its civilian logistics network. Military deliveries depend directly on that infrastructure. According to this serviceman, food shortages have already begun appearing in certain sectors. Fuel reserves still exist, but they're gradually being depleted. He also claims that military warehouses are struck far more often than most people realize. Unfortunately, he doubts these problems will actually be addressed. The same pattern repeats itself. Bad news is hidden from senior commanders. Officials look the other way. Everyone keeps pretending that everything is under control and that victory is just around the corner. That, he says, reflects the real situation on the ground. And conditions continue to deteriorate. Russian forces have sharply increased the number of strikes against Ukrainian logistics. Maps published over the first 9 Days of July show a growing number of destroyed fuel stations and damaged fuel infrastructure. If gasoline supplies continue shrinking at this pace, serious logistical problems become almost inevitable. At the same time, Ukraine is carrying out increasingly powerful strikes against Russian logistics as well. Researcher Clement Molin documented 240 Ukrainian strikes against Russian logistics vehicles during that same period in July. These weren't random attacks along highways. They specifically targeted supply trucks. That represents an average of 34 attacks per day along the Novorossiya logistics corridor, compared to roughly 20 per day in June. The increase reflects two major developments. First, Russian electronic warfare systems, air defenses, and specialized units like Rubicon have become far more effective at countering Ukrainian drones. Second, Ukraine's objective of cutting off the Dnipro group of forces from its supply lines simply cannot be achieved at the current pace. Much more is required. I've said this before. The concept is sound. The execution is competent. The scale is the problem. An army operates with thousands of vehicles. A single division requires roughly 3 to 4,000 trucks and support vehicles to sustain combat operations. Destroying 34 vehicles a day is nowhere near enough. At that rate, it would take an extremely long time to cripple Russian logistics. If Ukraine wants to achieve that objective, the number of successful strikes must increase dramatically. Not by 50%. Ideally, by 50 times. Even a tenfold increase would make a meaningful difference. So let's stay realistic. Despite the impressive work Ukrainian drone operators are doing along the Novorossiya corridor, they're still a long way from completely cutting off Russian supply lines. That remains beyond reach for now. However, what Major Robert Bravdi, better known as Madyar, has accomplished along that route, together with Ukraine's continuing attacks on Russian tankers in the Sea of Azov, is producing measurable effects. Another report indicates that 13 more tankers were struck overnight. Frankly, I'm astonished by the way Russian command continues sending so many virtually defenseless tankers across those waters. For many of those vessels, it's practically a one-way trip. The total number of damaged tankers is now approaching 50. If this trend continues, there may soon be very few left operating in the area. These attacks are having their greatest impact on Crimea. Fuel supplies there have become increasingly strained. In some areas, gasoline prices are reportedly approaching 200 rubles per liter. That's an enormous burden for ordinary residents. Crimea isn't populated by millionaires. Most people simply can't afford fuel at those prices. Yet there's one important aspect of this fuel crisis that many commentators continue to overlook. Personally, I have no objection to people criticizing the crisis or emphasizing how severe it has become. In fact, I was among the first to compare the Russian fuel crisis of 2026 to the bread crisis of 1916. That historical comparison still seems relevant. It's entirely possible we're witnessing a classic black swan event. A precisely timed Ukrainian campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure has produced consequences far beyond what many expected. Unlike earlier, less coordinated attacks, these strikes have followed a systematic strategy, targeting key oil refineries one after another. According to this assessment, roughly a quarter of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline. When the world lost roughly 11% of globally traded oil flowing through the Persian Gulf, international markets ultimately stabilized faster than many analysts expected. Oil prices briefly climbed, but never remained above roughly $125 per barrel, and governments successfully relied on strategic reserves to ease the shock. Russia, however, is experiencing something entirely different. Instead of coordinated crisis management, we're seeing confusion, poor decision-making, and growing disorder. Even Russian oil and gas experts now openly admit that the situation is slipping out of control. But I'll repeat an argument I've made before. At first glance, this fuel crisis looks like an outright disaster. That's because most observers evaluate it from the perspective of Russia's national economic interests. The Kremlin may be looking at it very differently. For the hardliners pushing for total war, full economic mobilization, and eventual confrontation with the West, not just Ukraine, the current fuel crisis may actually serve a useful purpose. Here's why. First, it weakens small and medium-sized private businesses. From the perspective of a wartime economy, those businesses consume labor and resources while contributing relatively little to military production. Compared with large industrial enterprises, they generally operate with lower productivity and lower efficiency. Their greatest contribution during peacetime is simply supporting themselves instead of relying on government assistance. But wartime changes those priorities. If military factories desperately need workers, those workers have to come from somewhere. One way to accomplish that is by allowing small businesses to collapse. Once those businesses disappear, both their owners and employees have few alternatives. Many would eventually be forced into jobs supporting defense production. From the standpoint of a fully mobilized wartime economy, that's considered an advantage. The second effect is lower civilian consumption. As living standards decline, fewer people can afford to drive personal vehicles or purchase non-essential goods. For military planners, that also creates benefits. Lower living standards reduce the cost of recruiting contract soldiers. If Russia were ever drawn into a larger confrontation with NATO, especially if maritime trade routes were disrupted and energy export revenues collapsed, the government would need to finance its military with fewer available resources. Cheaper labor makes that easier. In other words, lower living standards could translate into lower military payroll costs. From that perspective, some hardliners may see no urgent reason to fight the fuel crisis at all. Instead, they may prefer allowing it to deepen. There's a third reason why some people inside the Kremlin may not view this fuel crisis as entirely negative. Oil refineries have proven to be vulnerable targets. Whether they're struck by Ukraine today or by advanced Western weapons in the event of a broader war with NATO, they're exposed. In a full-scale conflict, thousands of long-range cruise missiles could be launched. Protecting every refinery would be nearly impossible. From that perspective, why encourage civilians to depend on private vehicles? Why maintain high civilian fuel consumption at all? People can use public transportation. They can walk. Private vehicles, if necessary, could eventually be requisitioned for military use. Everything for the front. Everything for victory. At least, that's how wartime planners might see it. Reducing civilian gasoline consumption would conserve fuel for military operations. And politically, it creates a convenient narrative. The government can point to Ukrainian attacks as the cause of the crisis, rather than its own decisions. Responsibility shifts outward. What I'm describing isn't entirely new. It's essentially an extension of ideas that Andrei Belousov promoted long before becoming Russia's defense minister. He repeatedly argued that Russia needed to reduce what he called unproductive consumption. In other words, fewer resources devoted to civilian life and more directed toward strategic industry. People should work in military factories instead of consuming more goods. That's why I'm far from convinced the Kremlin sees this crisis as purely negative. I'm not suggesting it deliberately created the problem, but it's becoming increasingly obvious that very little is being done to solve it. That strongly suggests that influential groups inside the Russian leadership may actually consider the situation useful. From their perspective, Ukraine is effectively preparing Russian society for total war. And politically, all the blame can be placed on President Zelensky. It's difficult to imagine a more convenient scenario. The fuel crisis itself may eventually become secondary. Its real significance could be that it helps justify much broader policies. Military mobilization, tighter control over society, restrictions on civilian consumption, even government regulation of fuel distribution could become much easier to explain. Under these conditions, everything begins to fit into the logic of wartime mobilization. In that sense, every action produces consequences far beyond its immediate objective. The reality may be even more serious than it first appears.